Long time no see. Welcome to another episode of Thoughts Becoming a Techno Wizard. And today, finally doing another episode of this reading Anarchy. So we're going to cover this section of how will a common anti-authoritarian ecological ethos come about. So last time we talked about what was it? Reparations, right? How reparations be worked out. And that was a pretty cool chapter. Now we're getting to the last chapters of one of the last sections of chapter 6, talking about the anti-authoritarian ecological ethos. Um, and I like that he's addressing this because this is, a concern of like anarchists or just decentralized ideas, right? The idea that this is concept. Goodness, I'm all over the place. This is idea, right? That people can't have big plans and strategic goals, with the decentralized system. That we can't come together to figure out things like big problems like climate change or do big projects and things like that. But I think this is going to address that. Um, this is a long section, so I should just get into it. So here we go. An anarchist society will work best if it develops a culture that values cooperation, autonomy, and environmentally sustainable behaviors. The way a society is structured can encourage or hinder such an ethos, just as our current society rewards competitive, oppressive, and polluting behaviors and discourages anti authoritarian ones. Exactly. In a non coercive society, social structures cannot force people to live in accordance with anarchist values. People have to want to do so. Ooh, excuse me, and personally identify with such values themselves. Fortunately, the act of rebelling against an authoritarian capitalist culture can itself popularize anti-authoritarian values. So I know this is a long section, but I really have to say some stuff about this first section as well, this first paragraph, because this is a huge thing I really hate about how a lot of people view the world today, right? They're like, oh, anarchy, it can't be possible, right? Because people look at people, they're all selfish, they're always in it for themselves, they're always they always have these power plays and all this other stuff. But all those arguments completely ignore or downright kind of downplay the reality that we live in, the fact that our environment itself, right, not just the physical environment, but like the psychological environment, right, the societal environment that we live in, that some people have created. And I was going to say we have created, but some people have created and that we're all kind of forced to live in. It forces us to participate in this, right? It forces people to behave in the ways that we see, right? Yes, humans do always have the capacity to be selfish or to be violent or whatever, right? But we know if you look into any psychological, study, or if you look into any sort of anthropological research, which I'm sure they're going to get into shortly, you'll see that uh, the capacity for violence or selfishness or whatever is dependent upon the environment in which people live, right? It's just like with the wolves, right? He did that. There's that researcher that did the study that came up with the term of the alpha wolf, right? But when he went back and studied the wolves, he saw that no, in a regular environment, they actually don't have any sort of hierarchy, right? They don't have any sort of alpha or anything like that. And in fact, he's been trying to walk back that term for decades now, because he realized that only really happens in captivity, right? In the most extreme, terrible environments where these wolves, are forced to, live in an unnatural way. That's what's happening with humanity, right? Is that we force ourselves to live under this idea of scarcity, right? Of artificial scarcity. Because even though it is true that there is a finite amount of resources in the world, it's also true that those most resources replenish if you just give it time, right? But because of how our society is developed, how we're constantly consuming, we don't give things time to replenish, right? And so on the basic level, you have that forced scarcity, not because there's no such thing as finiteness, but because our consumption-based society is constantly taking things in and not allowing it to replenish. So we put ourselves in this environment of scarcity. And on top of that, right, we live in a society where we force ourselves to, if you want to be successful, right, you're forced to play these games. If you want to be successful in politics and um and companies and starting your own company, things like that, once you get to a certain scale, you're forced to be, a little immoral, to bend your morals in order to, do good business, right? Oh, it's just business, right? And I could go all day with this stuff, but the fact of the matter is that, and parenting is another great example. But anyways, the fact of the matter is that our society is not some, essentialist thing. Like it's created, right? Many of the behaviors that see people that we see as normal today are created, right? They're a result of the type of environment that we live in. And therefore, if we have an anarchist environment, right, where there is nobody who can force you to live a certain way, there's nobody who can control who has access to what resources and things like that, then people will utilize skills and personalities and, behaviors that are conducive to cooperation, that are conducive to communicating, that are conducive to a more egalitarian, fair environment. So yeah, it's just that one, that's a big one for me. Let's continue. I'll try to do a little bit less talking now because this is a lot we got to cover. Anarchist anthropologist David Graeber writes of the Samahiti in Madagascar who rebelled and removed themselves from the, or I guess rebelled and removed themselves from the Moranestra dynasty. Even over a century after this rebellion, the Samahiti are marked by resolutely egalitarian social organization and practices to such an extent that it defines their very identity. Awesome. I'm gonna have to look them up. Let me just copy. I'll come back to it. Uh, the new name of the tribe the new name the tribe chose for themselves, Samedi, means those who do not cut their hair, in reference to the custom of subjects of the Moran Setra to cut their hair as a sign of submission. Interesting. During the Spanish Civil War in 1936, a number of cultural changes took place. In the countryside, politically active youth played a leading role in challenging conservative customs and pushing their villages to adopt an anarchist communist culture. The position of women in particular began to change rapidly. Women organized the anarcho-feminist group Mujeres Libres to help accomplish the goals of revolution and ensure that women enjoyed a place at the forefront of the struggle. Women fought on the front, literally joining the anarchist militias to hold the line against the fascists. Mujeres Libres or organized firearms courses, schools, childcare programs, and women-only social groups to help women gain the skills they needed to participate in the struggle as equals. Members of Mujeres Libres argued with their male comrades, emphasizing the importance of women's liberation as a necessary part of any revolutionary struggle. It was not a minor concern to be dealt with after the defeat of fascism. That's another great point, right? This is what I love about anarchism, like actual kind of participatory anarchism, is that you're not prioritizing certain, goals over others, right? It's not about, oh, we'll get to that, right? We'll get to the racism after we figure out classism, right? We'll get to the um, excuse me, we'll get to the, feminism after we solve patriarchy or after we solve, um, inequality in finances, right? Or whatever. It's not prioritizing people's goals over another. The whole point of anarchy is that it's a process, right? It's a process of being egalitarian. It's a process of being equal. It's a process of trying to hear as many voices as possible, trying to empower as many people as possible, right? All of that is part of the program, if you will. Um, and that's what makes it so powerful and so everlasting. And I think oftentimes when these programs fall apart, it's not because anarchism failed. It's because people didn't want to to be right. It's because they wanted to be more communist or this, that, and the other. Like, oh, we're gonna prioritize this over everybody else's thing, right? And it inherently will fall apart because of that. So this is why it's so important to show people why, what anarchism actually is, right? In the cities of oh yeah, in the cities of Catalonia, social restrictions on women lessened considerably. For the first time in Spain, women could walk alone on the streets without a chaperone. Not to mention that many were walking down the streets wearing militia uniforms and carrying guns. Anarchist women like Lucia Sanchez Sarnil wrote about how empowering it was for them to change the culture that had oppressed them. Male observers from George Orwell to France Bourquinu remarked on the changed conditions of women in Spain. Awesome. In the uprising spurred by Argentina's economic collapse in 2001, participation in the popular assemblies helped formerly apolitical people build an anti authoritarian culture. Another form of popular resistance, the Picatero movement, exerted a great influence on the lives and culture of many of the unemployed. The Picateros were unemployed people who masked their faces and set up pickets, shutting down the highways to cut off trade and gain leverage for demands such as food from supermarkets or unemployment subsidies. Aside from these activities, the Piqueteros also self organized an anti capitalist economy, including schools, media groups, clothing giveaway shops, bakeries, clinics, and groups to fix up people's houses and build infrastructure such as sewage systems. That's awesome right there. That's amazing. Many of the Picatero groups were affiliated with the Movement of Unemployed Workers, MTD. Their movement had already developed considerably before the December 2001 run on the banks by the middle class, and in many ways, they were the forefront of the struggle in Argentina. Mm. Two indie media volunteers who traveled to Argentina from the US and Britain to document the rebellion for English speaking countries spent time with the group in the Admiral Brown neighborhood south of Buenos Aires. The members of this particular group, similar to many of the Picateros in the MTD, have been driven to activism only recently by unemployment. But their motivations were not purely material. For example, they frequently held cultural and educational events. The two intermedia activists recounted a workshop held in an MTD bakery, in which the collective members discussed the differences between a capitalist bakery and an anti capitalist one. Reproduce for our neighbors, and to teach ourselves to do new things, to learn to produce for ourselves, explained a woman in her 50s. A young man in an Iron Maiden sweatshirt added, reproduce so that everyone can live better. That's beautiful. The same group operated El Ropero, a clothing shop, and many other projects as well. It was run by volunteers and dependent on donations, even though everyone in the area was poor. Despite these challenges, it opened twice a month to give out free clothes to people who could not afford them. The rest of the time, the volunteers mended old clothes that were dropped off. In the absence of the motives that drive the capitalist system, the people there clearly took pride in their work, showing off to visitors how well restored the clothes were despite the scarcity of materials. That's good stuff right there, man. And again, like I always like to think about this stuff, like how unemployment is it shows you how ridiculous kind of capitalism is. The fact that if you don't find a job for any reason, right? It could be because of injury, it could be because of um, um like having a mismatch of skills, it could be because of age, it could be because of mental problems, it could be all sorts of things. But without that, you're shit out of luck, right? You're starving on the street, and it gets in a downward spiral. But this is why I think it's so important that we build systems in which people can know how to do things for themselves, right? Know how to produce your own food, you know, um, repair your own things and stuff like that. Regardless of whether or not everybody wants to do it, we have to empower people who do want to do it, right? Because today we kind of assume that, oh, nobody wants to do all that, right? Nobody wants to do it. But really, a lot of people do. A lot of people do, right? But it's hard to eat. Like if you want to learn how to grow your own food today, right? How do you do that? If you don't have the land, the resources, the know, like you're not even going to begin to start. Yeah, you can look on YouTube or whatever, but if you don't have the resources, if you don't have the the space or anything, then it's just you're just looking at videos on YouTube, right? Because you don't have the time, because most of your time is going to be spent working, right, on your day job, and again, you may not have the money to buy the land and stuff like that. But if you live in a world where you don't have to work in order to make a living, then you actually can spend more time learning how to do things that you want to do, such as making food or making clothes or doing whatever you want to do. And then of course technology would make this stuff easier because nowadays we don't have to do all that. Like we do have the ability to automate a lot of the processes, and that would be hard to do, right? That would take a lot of time. But again, talking too much here. um the shared ideal among the Picteros included a firm commitment to non hierarchical forms of organization and participation by all members, young and old, in their discussions and activities. Women were often the first to go to the picket lines and came to hold considerable power within the Picatero movement. Within these autonomous organizations, many women gained the opportunity to participate in large scale decision making or take on other male dominated roles for the first time in their lives. At a particular bakery holding the workshop described above, a young woman was in charge of security, another traditionally male role. Again, we like to assume that, oh, um it things are the way it is because that's how people want it to be, right? Like, oh, women don't want to be in security roles, women don't want to do this. This is the same arguments people use, 100 years ago. Women don't want to, work at these types of companies, or women don't want to do science or whatever, when in reality we're just the our society's just not allowing them to do it, right? But as soon as you allow them to do it, you find more people wanting to do it, right? And yes, they may still be a sort of, a shift, or in not quite an imbalance, but there may be more, of one type of gender, or demographic or whatever in one, job type than others, right? That may still be true, but the point is that people still have the opportunity to do it, right? If they can. If you just don't allow people to do it because you assume they don't want to do it, then you'll never, empower those people that actually want to do it. It's simple. um, Throughout the 2006 rebellion in Oaxaca, as well as before and after, indigenous culture was a wellspring of resistance. However much they exemplified cooperative, anti authoritarian, and ecologically sustainable behaviors before colonialism, indigenous peoples in the Oaxacan resistance came to cherish and emphasize the parts of their culture that contrasted with the system that values property over life, encourages competition and domination, and exploits the environment into extinction. Their ability to practice an anti authoritarian and ecological culture, working together in a spirit of solidarity and nourishing themselves on the small amount of land they had, increased the potency of their resistance and thus their very chances of survival. Thus, resistance to capitalism and the state is both a means of protecting indigenous cultures and a crucible that forges a stronger anti authoritarian ethos. Many of the people who participated in the rebellion were not themselves indigenous, but they were influenced and inspired by indigenous culture. Thus, the act of rebellion itself allowed people to choose social values and shape their own identities. Beautiful. It's awesome stuff, man. Just give people the ability, empower people, and not through some face, opportunity like we like to say here in America. Oh, it's the land of opportunity, but it's really not, right? Because if you don't have the resources, the time, the connections and all this other stuff, you're shit out of luck. I guess you never even get to think of employing certain opportunities, much less actually, getting to try them. Before the rebellion, the impoverished state of Oaxaca sold its indigenous culture as a commodity to entice tourists and bring in business. The Guelaguetza, yeah, the Guelaguetza, an important gathering in native cultures, had become a state-sponsored tourist attraction. But during the rebellion in 2006, the state and tourism were pushed to the margins, and in July, the social movements organized as People's Guela- Guelaguetza, not to sell to the tourists, but to enjoy for themselves. After successfully blocking the commercial event set up for tourists, hundreds of students from Oaxaca City and people from villages across the state began organizing their own event. They made costumes and practiced dances and songs from all 7 regions of Oaxaca. In the end, the People's Guelaguetza was a huge success. Everyone attended for free, and the venue was packed. There were more traditional dances than there had ever been in the commercial Guelaguetzas. While the event had previously been performed for money, most of which was pocketed by the sponsors and government, it became a day of sharing as it had been traditionally. At the heart of an anti-capitalist, largely indigenous movement was a festival, a celebration of the values that hold the movement together, and a revival of indigenous cultures that were being wiped out or pared down to a marketable exoticism. This is that commodification is such a terrible thing right there. So it's good to see people going against that. While the Guelaguetza was reclaimed as a part of indigenous culture in support of an anti capitalist rebellion and the liberatory society it sought to create, another traditional celebration was modified to serve the movement. In 2006, the Day of the Dead, a Mexican holiday that syncretizes indigenous spirituality with Catholic influences, coincided with a violent government assault upon the movement. One second. I thought we were getting so dry so quickly. Whew. Just before the 1st of November, police forces and paramilitaries killed about a dozen people, so the dead were fresh in everybody's minds. Graffiti artists had long played an important role in the movement in Oaxaca, covering the walls with messages well before the people had seized radio stations to give themselves a voice. When the Day of the Dead and the heavy government repression coincided in November, these artists took the lead in adapting the holiday to commemorate the dead and honor the struggle. They covered the streets with the traditional tapetes, colorful murals made from sand, chalk, and flowers. But this time, the tapetes contained messages of resistance and hope, or portrayed the names and faces of all the people killed. People also made skeleton sculptures and altars for each person murdered by the police and paramilitaries. One graffiti artist, Yeska, described it. This year, on the Day of the Dead, the traditional festivities took on new meaning. The intimidating presence of the federal police troops filled the air. An atmosphere of sadness and chaos hung over the city. But we managed to overcome our fear and our loss. People want to carry on with the traditions, not only for their ancestors, but also for all those fallen in the movement in recent months. Although it sounds a bit contradictory, Day of the Dead is when there is the most life in Oaxaca. There are carnivals and people dressed up in different costumes, such as devils or skeletons full of colorful feathers. They parade through the streets dancing or creating theatrical performances of comical daily happenings, this year with a socio political twist. We didn't let the federal police forces standing guard stop our celebrating or our mourning. The whole tourist pathway in the center of the city, Macedonia Alcala, was full of life. Protest music was playing, and people danced and watched the creation of our famous sand murals called tapetes. We dedicated them to all the people killed in the movement. Anyone who wanted to could join in to add to the mosaics. The mixed colors express our mixed feelings of repression and freedom, joy and sadness, hatred and love. The artwork and the chants permeating the street created an unforgettable scene that ultimately transformed our sadness into joy. Beautiful stuff. Um, Let me see how long this is. Oh gosh, we got we got quite a bit. I'm probably gonna stop after this quote, and we'll continue the next time next week. While artwork and traditional festivals played a role in the development of a liberating culture, the struggle itself, specifically the barricades, provided a meeting point where all alienation was shed and neighbors built new relationships. One woman described her experience. You find all kinds of people at the barricades. A lot of people tell us that. Oh, excuse me. Goodness, sorry. A lot of people tell us they met at the barricades, even though they were neighbors. They didn't know each other before. They'll even say, I didn't ever talk to my neighbor before because I didn't think I liked him. But now that we're at the barricade together, he's a compañero. So the barricades weren't just for traffic barriers, but became spaces where neighbors could chat and communities could meet. Barricades became a way that communities empowered themselves. This is so powerful, right? Because I talked about this all the time as well. How we design our communities is is crucial to how we actually form a community, right? The neighborhoods that many of us live in today are not communities, right? They're not real communities. Like, how many times have you talked to your neighbors? I know. I for one barely talk to most of these folks. Like, it's only like this person across the street who we talk to, right? Most of our other neighbors we don't talk to. All right. It could be because we don't think we'll get along, or just because it feels inappropriate, right? Because how it's designed, every house feels like its own like private thing. So it feels weird to go in, to somebody's door and knock on the door like, hey, how you doing? Can I get some sugar? Like, nobody actually does that. At least not in my neighborhood or any other neighborhoods I've been into, right? And I think it's the design of the space that really discourages real communal behavior versus something like these barricades, which could be like, I'm imagining it like, I mentioned somewhat similar to like a park, right? In a park, people are just out and about, and so you have the expectation of that you can communicate with people and things like this. But in a regular, type of neighborhood, people are only ever out when they're walking, right? And you don't really want to talk to them too much because they're walking, like they're kind of doing their exercise in, right? People still might do it a little bit, but not by much. Um, and there's just not enough, uh, design. There's not enough incentive, not enough kind of things to push people to communicate with each other, right? To form these relationships organically. And so because of that, we often feel isolated. We often feel like we can't talk to our neighbors, and therefore we don't build real community. This is why it's so important for well, this is why urban centers are so like powerful, right? Because these dense areas facilitate more communication between people. And the same thing can be said for small towns, but not just as a small town. Like that small town itself has to have areas in which people can, communicate, such as, you might have like a town hall where people regularly meet, or a church, or, a bar, or whatever. It's like there's a place people go to in order to communicate and have that connection. It can't just be a stack of houses. It can't just be a bunch of buildings, right? You need a central area. You need a communal space where people can communicate, and that's what we're really missing a lot of in today's society. And so, this is why stuff like this is so powerful for that. But yeah, we'll end this here. Um, we'll continue next week. Hopefully next week. I won't. I'll make some time. And stay tuned. Next up, I'm going to talk about. We're going to get back into reading some Hegel, and yeah. So, thanks as always for listening, and have a great day. Let me know what you thought and learned from this chapter, and yeah, see you later.